All right. Let's hope we can free our minds of these matters now and turn to something a little more substantive, which is the question, before we plunge into Gadamer, really perhaps the question, what is hermeneutics? Well, it's easily enough explained what it is, despite the sort of difficulty and thorniness of the word. It is the art or principles of interpretation. But hermeneutics has a history. That is to say, it's not something which has always been just there. It's not something that people have always thought about in a systematic way. Strictly speaking, what I've just said isn't true. Many of you probably know that Aristotle has a treatise called De Interpretatione. The Middle Ages are rife with treatises on interpretation. And I suppose what I'm really saying is that the word hermeneutics wasn't available, and the idea that there ought to be a sort of a systematic study of how we interpret things wasn't really current. But of course, by the same token, the notion of hermeneutics arises primarily in religion first. And specifically in the Christian tradition, but that isn't to say that there wasn't long before the moment at which hermeneutics became important in Christianity. That's not to say that there wasn't centuries worth of Talmudic scholarship, which is essentially also hermeneutic in nature, that is to say, concerned with the art and basis of interpretation. But what gave rise to, in the Western world, to what is called hermeneutics was, in fact, the Protestant Reformation. And there's a lot of significance of that in that, I think, and I'll try to explain why. You don't really puzzle your head about questions of interpretation, how we interpret, validity of interpretation, and so on, until A, meaning becomes terribly important to you, and B, the ascertainment of meaning becomes difficult. And you say to yourself, well, isn't it always the case that meaning is important and that meaning is hard to construe? Well, not necessarily. You know, if you are a person whose sacred scripture is adjudicated by the Pope and the occasional tribunal of church elders, you yourself don't really need to worry very much about what Scripture means. You're told what it means. It goes without saying, therefore, what it means. But in the wake of the Protestant Reformation, when the question of one's relationship with the Bible became personal, and everyone was understood, if only through the local minister, to be engaged with coming to an understanding of what is, after all, pretty difficult. Who on earth knows what the parables mean, and so on, and the whole of the Bible poses interpretive difficulties. Then, of course, you're going to have to start worrying about how to interpret it. And needless to say, since it's a sacred scripture, the meaning of it is important to you. You do want to know what it means. It can't mean just anything. It's crucial to you to know exactly what it means and why what it means is important. And so, as Protestantism took hold, by the same token, the arts and sciences of hermeneutics took hold, and people began to write treatises about interpretation. But it was always interpretation of the Bible. In other words, in this tradition, religion came first. After that, the next thing that happens is you begin to get the rise of constitutional democracies. And as you get that, you begin to become much more interested as a citizen or as a person who has suffrage, or as a person in one way or another has the rights of the state or nation. You begin to become concerned about the nature of the laws you live under. And that's why hermeneutics gradually moved, not deserting religion, but, so I should say, expanded to the study of the law. And the arts and sciences that had been developed in thinking about interpreting Scripture were then applied to the interpretation of something the meaning of which had become almost as important. That is to say, it mattered what the law was and how it was to be interpreted. And you know, of course, that this is absolutely crucial to the study of the law to this day. You know, what are the grounds for understanding the meaning of the Constitution, for example? There are widespread controversies about it, and many of the courses you would take in law school are meant to try to get to the bottom of these thorny questions. Well and good. Once again, you see that hermeneutics enters a field when the meaning of something becomes more important and when that meaning is recognized to be difficult to grasp. Now, as yet, you know, we haven't said anything about literature. And the fact is, there is no no hermeneutic art devoted to literature during the early modern period and for most of the 18th century. Think about, you know, the writers you've studied from the 18th century. It's very interesting that they all just sort of take meaning for granted. If you think about Pope, for example, or even Johnson, as they reflect on literature and why it's important and what the nature of literature is, they aren't concerned about interpretation. They're concerned about evaluation, establishing the principles of what's at stake in writing a poem or in writing some literature in some other form, and raise questions that are largely moral and aesthetic. They're not concerned about interpretation because to them, good writing is precisely writing that's clear, writing that doesn't need to be interpreted, but has as precisely as its virtue, its transparency of meaning. And in fact, during this whole period, playwrights were writing prologues to their plays, abusing each other for being obscure. That is to say, abusing each other for requiring interpretation. I don't understand what your metaphors are all about. You don't know what a metaphor is. All you do is make one verbal mistake after another. Nobody can understand you. This is the nature of the prose and verse prefaces to theatrical pieces in the 18th century. And from that you can see that interpretation is not only not studied, but is considered to be completely extraneous to what's valuable about literature. If you have to interpret it, it isn't any good. But then, as the 18th century wears on, you begin to get the sense, in the first place, you get, with the emergence of Romanticism, you get a kind of, as is well known and I think often overstated, you get a cult of genius. You get the idea that everything arises from the extraordinary mental acuity or spiritual insight of an author, and that what needs to be understood about literature is the genius of its production. Well and good. But at the same time, if that's the case, and if there's this extraordinary emphasis on the importance of the expression of genius, you can see what's beginning to happen. The literary creator starts to seem a lot more like the divine creator. That is to say, and in a certain sense, could be understood as a placeholder for the divine creator. Remember that secularization in Western culture is increasing during the course of the Enlightenment, that is to say, during the course of the 18th century, and there's a certain way in which Romanticism, and in what's important about Romanticism, can be understood as what Northrop Frye has called a secular scripture. In other words, the meaning of literature becomes more difficult because it's profoundly subjective and no longer no longer engaged with shared values. And the importance of literature, that is to say, our sense of why it's so important to understand it, has also grown because for many people it begins to take over, partly at least, the role of religion. And so with the rise of secular scripture, that is to say, literature imagined as something both terribly important and also difficult to understand, naturally the arts and sciences of hermeneutics begin to enter that field. And in particular, the great theologian of the Romantic period, Friedrich Schleiermacher, devoted his career to principles of hermeneutics that were meant to be applied as much to literature as to the study of Scripture, and established a tradition in which it was understood that literature was a central focus of hermeneutics. So much then for the history of hermeneutics. The work of Dilthey around the turn of the century, of Heidegger in his Being and Time, 1927, of Gadamer, who in many ways can be understood as a disciple and student of Heidegger, and a tradition which persists today, follows from the initial engagements of Schleiermacher during the Romantic period with literature.